Welcome back. This is week 9, lecture 2, the problem of the Middle East. Now, this lecture follows on the previous lecture with the Russian Revolution, dealing both with this period between World War I and then the outbreak of World War II, or between the Great War and then what would become known as World War II. Now, the problem with the Middle East is a problem because, as I'm assuming all of you know, we are very much today in the midst of a crisis in the Middle East. There's been crises in the Middle East for a long, long time. And in terms of the relevance of history, at least Western civilization to this course, we can't really understand or begin to understand the issues that are involved in the conflicts that are taking place now um, without seeing the historical development and background to it. At this time, in this day and age, in the present moment even, the issue of Israel and Palestine um, is fraught with tensions, very viscerally held beliefs and assertions. And my intent in this lecture is not to take sides. My intent is not to argue that one side is right, the other side is wrong. As I think as we'll go through this lecture, I think you'll see that, in my view, somewhat historically seen, both sides are wrong. Now, the issue, too, brings up the larger question of inherent political right and the extent to which inherent political right is an issue or a matter or consequence of military conquest. Somehow, we humans, or Westerners in any case, seem to have to try to justify our military power and might. And so we devise or appeal to either theological, religious reasons or philosophical, ideological reasons to justify moving into territories, conquering, and on we go. We could say, okay, what was the basis for the European colonization? It was a pure greed. Well, not pure greed, but that was part of it. I mean, I think, as I tried to discuss, there was so many different factors in terms of colonization and why colonized. Trade is a major issue. The profit motive is a major issue. But so was then the concept of mission to convert these people, and on we go. So it becomes a very problematic endeavor. What was the right of British settlers and colonists coming to this new territory, landmass, and expelling and repressing the native population, the native indigenous population, to establish a new political entity? What is it? Well, all kinds of justifications were given. The everything from God-given right, the promised land, and all these things, the promised land of the United States, um, and the city on the hill, the Puritan idea of the city on the hill, go and conquest and spread the gospel, so to speak. And so it gets to be, it's a problem that's going on in the Middle East that is an inherent problem within the Western tradition as such. And if we remain in the realm of theology, religion, or philosophy, ideology, we're not going to solve the conflict. We have to understand, and I'm not, again, I'm not going to legitimate, and I've said before, I'm not going to talk about the theology and religious views in terms of taking sides, but we have to understand the beliefs behind the actions. So what I want to do in this lecture is kind of trace the entire history, so to speak, of the conflict based on historical evidence. That's what history and historians do, rather than try to use historical evidence for supporting one side or the other in terms of the theological, religious, ideological conflict. I hope that makes sense and comes across, because I'm not sure, I guess speaking now as me person and individual, not as me history professor, but I'm not sure the Middle East will ever be quote unquote solved if we can't get beyond the religious theological claims that both sides have, so to speak, because it gets all messed up in with economic aspects. Oil, surprise, surprise, oil in our modern world, and it becomes a real mess. You know, we'll be talking about the Middle East at least twice more. And so this is just going to be focusing on the period leading up to what the outbreak of war again, in what we talk about as the outbreak of World War II. Now, I'm assuming you all know or have heard about the Holocaust and what was going on in World War II, which we'll be talking about, and then the aftermath thereof, and then again in later lectures talking about in the 60s and the really continued conflict and kind of, let's say, renewed conflict in the Middle East. So this is just kind of setting the stage, so to speak, for further developments. And we'll go to that. But we can't understand those further developments without understanding this background. Okay? I hope that puts it in perspective so that we're clear on where I'm coming from, or consciously attempting to come from, which is, again, looking at the historical evidence and looking at the religious claims as important historical factors, central historical factors. But just as I think I've argued, maybe I didn't, but as I should have if I didn't, and as I always do, the same applies to Christianity. If I talk about the impact of Christianity, that is not me defending Christianity or saying that the Christian position is the correct one. It's simply looking at the impact of the theological ideas, the religious ideas, and the concepts and the ideology behind it. So the same thing applies to Judaism and to Islam and to the political conflicts resulting from that clash. Okay, that being said, I hope. If you have any questions about this, please just email me and we can talk about it, okay? So, to look at the conflict, we have to go all the way back to looking at the religious claims of both sides, so to speak, and how they all developed. And for the problems that are here, it's in some ways between, let's say, the Islam and Judaism. It is over an interpretation of the quote-unquote biblical history, the biblical account that we have in the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament. And we'll see Islamic claims textually come up much later, but they are making claims, or they did make claims, that then reinterprets the entire history, so to speak, of the biblical texts. And it's based on this distinction between the stories that are told and then the historical evidence. You say, well, aren't stories historical evidence? Yes, they're evidence of stories. But unless there is some kind of evidence outside those stories themselves, there's no way to verify the truth of those stories. And this is, again, where I talked about history and myth. Myth comes into play because myth is a truth, an experienced truth expressed in stories that are not necessarily literally true. And so with the historical account as it is presented in the Hebrew Bible / Christian Old Testament, scholars more recently have, since the 1970s, basically, later 1970s, have questioned the extent to which those stories are, quote unquote, actually historical, or whether they're just stories that served as a unifying basis for group identity. So let's look at this, because just briefly, it used to be that we could all assume that students had a fairly decent grasp of the biblical accounts and biblical histories and things, but I'm not assuming that any of you do. I'm assuming that probably many of you have heard of some of the people I'll be talking about or the figures and names I'll be talking about. But I just wanted to touch briefly, I'm not going to go through the whole biblical history, on some of the major developments and implopments, as they called in the stories. Because that brings us to, as a beginning point, going back to ancient history, to the figure of Abraham. Now you see on the slide there that Abraham, in the traditional biblical account, was born somewhere around 1960 BC. Oh, I had to have BE there. I'm sorry, it should be BCE. That is my typo, and I apologize for that because Abraham was born around 1960 or 1960 BCE. According to the biblical account, Abraham, and first Abram, and I'm not going to go into all the biblical stories about Abraham. He and his wife Sarah could not bring forth a child, so according to the biblical text, Sarah encouraged Abraham to have sex with her slave Hagar so that he could have a son. And Abraham went along with it, and did produce a son. So Abraham and Hagar, which according to the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, was Sarah's slave, bore a son named Ishmael. And that was approximately in 1874 BCE. And then as the biblical story goes along, angel came and told Abraham that, their prayers had been heard and that Sarah would bring forth a son. And they both, Sarah and Abraham both thought, you got to be kidding me because Sarah's too old, blah, 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 blah. So it was a miraculous birth. But indeed, sure enough, Sarah did become pregnant, and Abraham and Sarah's son Isaac was born approximately 1860 BCE, or some 14 years after Ishmael, and whereupon the birth of Isaac is a legitimate son of Abraham and Sarah. They sent Hagar and Ishmael away, banished them, because it still was the issue of kind of legitimacy. And we don't hear much at all about Ishmael and Hagar thereafter in the biblical texts. But the biblical texts still, we know, have the concept of this promised land for the ancient Israelites, for those followers of Yahweh. God had promised a homeland, and that became Israel. And Israel developed, and under the so-called great monarch Saul and his son David and David's son Solomon, there was a united monarchy of two kingdoms. Israel and Judah formed a united monarchy under Saul, David, and Solomon. And that was supposedly then, that united monarchy existed from approximately 1090 to approximately 922 BCE. Now, what do we do with this? Because in the biblical text, it's this glorious golden age of Israel as the kingdom, together with Judah united under these three great kings, the 12 tribes coming from the 12 sons of Abraham, all kind of joining together. Now, historically speaking, Israel and Judah seems to have been separate kingdoms by around 900 BCE. And then the kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, as it's called, into 722 BCE. Now, the Neo-Assyrian Empire is an historical aspect, and as I'll be talking about then shortly when we get to the historical development, there are some indications of a kingdom of Israel and a kingdom of Judah, but not quite the way it was portrayed in the biblical texts. Certainly the Assyrian Empire and the taking over of Jerusalem and the city of Jerusalem is historically, there's historical evidence for it. But the problem then is this region of the Holy Land, today referred to as Israel and or Palestine, depending on which side you take, together with Syria and the whole region today. And we'll be looking more at that and with maps and things as we go along. Um, the Jewish position is that this was the land that God had promised Abraham and his descendants. Well, the issue is when Islam arose, and with Muhammad, and Muhammad dies in 630. I'll be talking more about this when we get there too. And with the Quran, which was the revelations given to Muhammad, the Quran claims a rather different story. The Quran claims that Hagar was Abraham's legitimate wife, and therefore Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn, and that the descendants of Ishmael became the Arabs, and then later on, of course, the Muslims, Islam. So that it all stems from Ishmael, the Ishmaelites, as a legitimate son of Abraham. And Sarah was a second wife, and therefore also Isaac didn't have the right of inheritance. Now, there's no evidence of that until the Quran. It's a religious claim. But the problem here is if that were true, if God had revealed the Quran to Muhammad through the mouth of Gabriel, angel Gabriel, then that's the truth. Doesn't matter what the Jews argued, because they're wrong, because we know the divine truth. And does it matter that there's no evidence for that prior to the Quran? There's no claims that the Arabs descended from Ishmael before the Quran. But again, if it's divine revelation, then it's truth, and always was true and always will be true, regardless of what anybody else thinks. That's the tension, just as the Jewish claim is that God had promised this territory to the descendants of Abraham through Isaac. Prove it. That's the problem. You can't. So the issue is these are both religious, theological claims of divine revelation. How does that play out in the political, military power struggles over the territory? And that's where we get this issue of history and truth, because if one side is true in the ultimate sense, then it's true. But that's not for the historian to determine. The historian cannot determine, oh, yes, God did this, and this is what God said. The historian cannot say, here's all the history, and that shows that, yes, God did promise the land to the Israelites, and Abraham and the Israelites, and therefore Israel and the Jews. Nor can we say, as an historian, that, oh, the revelation of Muhammad is true, and therefore this land actually belongs to the Islam and the Muslims and the Arabs, the Arab Muslims. The historian can't say that. There's no evidence. All we can do is point to the evidence that does exist very clearly of those two competing claims and the problems that those two competing claims have caused throughout the years. And this is in conjunction to them with the whole problem of Christianity and how does Christianity relate to Judaism and then Islam. It's a mess, historically. And the historian can't say that the Christians are right either. We have to look at the claims and beliefs that are being asserted as the basis for actions to find out and try to say, okay, how did this play out? Why did people believe this? And why did people believe this? And how did this develop and emerge? Okay, they're claiming that it was divine revelation. Historians are saying that could be, but that's not what we're going to appeal to say, yes, it was, or what, no, it wasn't. Well, what we can say is that is what these people believe that it was. Now, the point here is that history and historical truth is distinct from absolute theological truth or truth as such. And the basis for determination, historical truth, is historical evidence that can be verified. That's what we're looking at. So now, going from this religious claims on both sides, we're going to go through a little bit of what the historical evidence does allow us to say. And here we go, the historical region. One of the big distinctions we need to make in terms of quote unquote Palestine, or what's called or referred to as Palestine, or what's referred to as Israel, is that historically it's the term Palestine or Israel are not terms that refer to political entities, but to a territory. Israel there is more of a political entity, but Palestine is a territory. Prior to even the emergence of the name Palestine, we have local Arabic or Semitic tribes. I mean, there's a whole history of etymology of the term Arab and Arabic. This kind of predates both Palestine and Israel, or as such. I'm not going to go into all of that, but Semitic tribes, nomadic Semitic tribes, and we're going back to the origins of civilization, or going back to very early on. The first evidence we have is from around 1150 BCE. We find the name Paliset, refers to the name of a region, the territory. And around 850 BCE, there's earliest evidence for Israel as a local geographical political entity. This is from an Egyptian inscription. And so there's evidence that there is some kind of political thing, but what we're talking about here is a local tribe and the control of that tribe and where they are located. The term Yahweh has been shown to have been one of numerous local deities of different groups, and Yahweh was the deity of Israel, or the Jews. So we have this problem of, okay, how do we distinguish? Now, the entire biblical history, kind of as I talked about previously, just before getting to this part of it, has for so long been accepted as that's just historical. It's only been since like the mid-1970s or so that biblical scholars, archaeologists have said, what's the archaeological evidence? What can we actually point to validate these stories? And that's where all of this is coming from. We do know that the city of Jerusalem, which is evidenced as an existent city, and at first it's kind of not clear what's the relationship between the city of Jerusalem and these groups called, that were following Yahweh and were referenced as Israel, or seemingly were referenced as Israel. It falls to the Babylonians in 586 BCE. And then the Babylonian rule over the region falls to the Persian Empire in 539 BCE. And it's in this context of the Persian rule of the Middle Eastern territories that are now Palestine, Israel, Syria, Lebanon, and so that we find the earliest biblical traditions in terms of the textual traditions. The earliest biblical textual traditions can be dated to around 539 BCE in the context of the Persian rule. But what they do is they present a history for which there's really no evidence. There's no historical evidence to the United Kingdom, to David or Solomon, or Saul, David or Solomon. And this has been a major kind of shakeup, because biblical scholars for quite a long time accepted very clearly that the creation accounts in Genesis were not historical. That was not that big of a deal. Even going back to Augustine of Hippo, he pointed out the discrepancies between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Now, Augustine believed in creation, believed that Adam was a real single individual. But he says, these texts are texts, they're myths, they're getting at something that is true and real, but not in the details. They're not scientific accounts, they're not historical accounts. That's been known for a long time, but somehow seeing that as myth, though, was different when we get to ancient Israel and the United Kingdoms of Saul and David and Solomon. So that was like, oh my gosh, what we always had thought was actually indeed historical, scholars, again, since the 1970s on into the 1980s, are questioning and saying that there's no evidence really of that. It gets to be a real problem when we say, oh, how do we know what was going on? Now, I already said that around 1150 BCE, Paliset is a name for a region. And the first time we have the term Palestine is in Greek, but a Greek word that means Palestine, also Palestina in Latin, comes from Herodotus, kind of the father of history in his histories of the Persians and so. And that is dated to around 430 BCE. So before 430 BCE, there was no precise regional reference to Palestine. There was regional reference to Israel and to Jerusalem, but not as portrayed in the biblical text. So this region that was being then ruled first by the Persians and then just by various nomadic tribes was taken over by Alexander. And then with the breakup of Alexander's empire was ruled by the Ptolemies and the Seleucids around 300 BCE. Here's the map, the division of Empire of Alexander, 301 BCE. If you look at this map here, you can see the region. If you look at it, you can see, I know it's kind of hard to read a little bit, but the kind of the purple-esque region is the Kingdom of Ptolemy, and then we have the Seleucids, and the kind of the yellow, the green is Lysimachus, and the orange is Cassander. So Cassander was ruled over Macedonia, Thrace, Cappadocia, Armenia, Mesopotamia, and then we have Syria, and we have then Palestine, and then Egypt as we go down further southwest. So there's Tyre and Sidon. I mean, Jerusalem is not listed on this map. We have Egypt and the Nile and Alexandria. We have Syria, and Antioch and Cyprus and Mesopotamia and Babylon. And so you see where all those are. But what these names are not of political states, but of geographical regions. They're territories in terms of dividing up Alexander's empire. And thereafter, it's being ruled the region of Palestine, which is broader than what we refer to as today, was ruled by these Hellenistic rulers until a group of Jews, led by Joseph Maccabeus, revolted and captured Jerusalem in 164 BCE. Now, these are all, by this time we're getting into historical evidence and records that we can kind of progress and understand pretty well. And so then we have Jerusalem being ruled independently of the rest of the Hellenistic territory by a group of Jews, until then Rome takes over what happened in the Hellenistic and the breakup of Alexander's empire with the Ptolemies and Seleucids. And so beginning in 63 BCE, we have Roman rule in the region. And Roman rule referred to the region not as Palestine, but as Judea. That Judea was a Roman administrative province. That's what it was, based on conquest, just as it had been referred to as Palestine with Herodotus and the Greeks after, and with context of Alexander the Great. We have difficulties knowing how to refer to it. But with the Roman province, they refer to it as a kingdom or as the province of Judea, because there was supposedly a kingdom of Judah that was there. So they see it. Now, Romans ruled the region from 63 BCE until the fall of the Western Empire, and then the Eastern Empire, so-called the Byzantine Empire, ruled until 630 CE. But already between 132 and 136 CE now, there was constant tensions within the empire between the Jews, who lived predominantly in the province of Judea, and Roman rule. And there's all kinds of different references and tensions in different groups and different relationships. And there was always groups that were more of the radical factions that tried to throw off Roman administrative authority and power. And so there's a whole series of revolts. And finally, the Bar Kokhba revolt at 132 to 136, which was finally put down for the last time. And Rome says, we're done with this. And we're going to rename the region not as Judea, but as Palestine, Syria. So there's no longer going to be a Roman province called Judea. We're just going to get rid of that whole idea to help get rid of these Jews who've been causing us problems all along. The temple was destroyed in 70. It gets to be a real mess in terms of the Roman taking over of Jerusalem and the whole area. And what do we do with all of this? We have to get rid of the Jews because they keep revolting against us. So it's called really the diaspora from basically 70 CE with the destruction of the temple and previous Jewish uprisings to the final Jewish uprising of the Bar Kokhba revolt. And the Romans had had enough, so we're going to get up. So the Jews by that time are living what's called in diaspora. They have no region that they can refer to as their home based on geographical territory and tradition, much less an independent state. The terms refer to the region. That's important to keep in mind. Now, what happens in 630? I mean, the Western Roman Empire, quote unquote, falls in 476. That's a long story. And in Western Civilization 1, I addressed that and how Rome never really fell. But anyway, so there's the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Byzantine Empire, as it's more commonly known. And the rise of Islam begins and threatens the Byzantine Empire. I have it there. Muhammad dies in 632. And in 630 already, we have the Mamluk Turks and the Abbasid rule. The Abbasids is a particular dynasty. Once Islam starts taking off and Muhammad dies, and then we have these different rulers or families. We have first caliphates, and then we have larger caliphates, the Abbasids and the Umayyads, kind of the followers of Muhammad, split in two. But this is even before what became the Abbasids rule. But the Turks, the Islam by the West was referred to simply as the Turk. I'll get back to that too as well. And this is the context of the expansion of Islam after the death of Muhammad, threatening, quote unquote, threatening the West, or threatening the Byzantine Empire, and as we'll see shortly, even Western Europe and Christendom. And prior to 800 CE, but sometime before 800 CE, we have the earliest textual witnesses of the Quran. Even though Muslim scholars claim that the text of the Quran was already set by 650 CE, and this was a big issue because Muhammad was told that his revelation should never be written down. He had to eat the papers that were given to him, and he had to memorize it. But already just 20 years after his death, according to Islamic scholars of the tradition, it wasn't going to be feasible to transmit the revelation always by memory, by oral tradition and memory. We needed to get it down because there were splits within the Islamic understanding of what that revelation was that was given to Muhammad, and how do they understand it and receive it, so that we have to have a text. So we have some kind of document that we can prove what is part of it and what's not. So they kind of establish the text. Now, so Islamic scholar says that by 650, but the earliest evidence we have is sometime before 800. But by 800, it's clearly there's textual evidence of the Quran spreading as a text. So that becomes kind of the issue. Now, what happens then? If we look at the next slide, we'll see. First of all, I've kind of missed some of the maps, but here I'm looking at the slides and I forgot to show you the maps. Here we have the Roman Empire around 100 AD. You see, there's Judea. That's the, if you look down to the right, you have Egypt, then Judea, then Syria. That was the region that's referred to. And there you see where Jerusalem is. And then we have here too, with the spread of Islam and having taken over the region, Here's a map of the Muslim world around 1200. And then the key there shows the spread of the territories and the growth of Islam. And then the red lines are the borders or boundaries of kind of the influence of Islam. And if you look there, you see Jerusalem, you see Damascus, you see Egypt, because these were all ruled by, again, by various Islamic Arabic tribes. It's not setting up a state, it is looking at the spread of Islam and how it all kind of fit together. Now, we have then further developments from that situation of just the spread of Islam and the various caliphates that were going on, and the regional variations of these Arabic peoples who were primarily, but not exclusively, Islamic, because there were Jews and Christians living in the territory too. But Islam spreads and takes over, not as necessarily a state, but as the ruling concept and religion of the region. There's no, in that map of 1200, there's no designation. This is Palestine as an Arabic Muslim state, or any other states that we refer to today in the region. They weren't there. They're just names for general regional geographical territories. Now, that was in 1200. By the end of the 13th century, we have the establishment of the Ottoman Caliphate under the person named Turkoman. Now, I could say this is probably where the origins of the word Turk came from. I forget how it fits in with Ottoman. I think it's referring to, again, one of the regional local powers that was led by Turkoman. But the Ottoman Caliphate begins to grow and establish itself, and by 1453, the Ottomans conquer Constantinople, which had been the city, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, or what became known as the Byzantine Empire. So we had this growing and emerging Ottoman Empire that became a real threat to the West. In the 16th century, we have a lot of sources from the West. The Turk was a threat. That's what we're problem. What do we do about it? Because they're on our borders. And if we look at that next map, we can see then the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman I the Magnificent, because Suleiman was really quite a competent leader in general. And again, you can see the extent of the Ottoman Empire. And this is going to be getting closer and closer to World War I and the lead up into World War I and what's going on thereafter, because this was an extensive empire at the time in 1580. You can see it's right on the borders of Christendom and all the problems that were going on in Christendom in 1580 with the religious wars in France, with the civil wars in the empire that had already been settled, but there is kind of confusion in continental Europe based on the Reformation and the kind of crumbling of Christendom and disintegration of Christendom. And so it gets to be a real problem. But here with the Ottoman Empire, it is a major power in the region. Now, if you look there too, you don't see Palestine. You see Syria as kind of the designation of the region, and Mesopotamia, and Anatolia, and Georgia up there, and Tripoli, and Egypt. So these are terms that refer to the regions under the Ottoman Empire, which is the political entity. Now, beginning in the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire begins to decline. But here's another map in terms of the Ottoman Empire in 1683. You can see again the extent of its power and influence, including those tributary regions that recognized its authority and were not really satellites, but sort of satellite states recognizing the authority of the empire, Ottoman Empire, but not directly under the Ottoman Empire's direct rule. Territory begins to be lost. And we get to the 19th century, it becomes weakened. Now we can see if this is established in 1453 with the conquest of Constantinople, we're talking, almost 500 years here of the flourishing and growth and expansion of the Ottoman Empire. In the 19th century, it starts to kind of decline, and that is really too a major victory for Russia, which I talked about a little bit yeah, last lecture, the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878, which really was a Russian victory. um, if you remember last lecture, talking about the weakening of the Russian Empire, and it was, but the Turkish War was a bit of a success within kind of ongoing failure, so to speak. Um, and that weakened and diminished the Ottoman Empire itself. And this, too, keep in mind with the Russo-Turkish Wars in context of nationalism and imperialism. We talked about the new imperialism and nationalism. And the unification of Germany was in 1871, and the unification of Italy. So this is all going on in Europe, and they're also fighting over territories, colonies, the imperial world that they are trying to break up, and fight over as part of their own powers of the nation state that's emerging in the context of nationalism. And then we have the outbreak of World War One. I've already talked about the lead up to that. And the Ottomans really lost out in terms of World War One. And there was the Franco-Turkish War, 1918 to 1919, which just kind of continued the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. The French, this is like right directly as the Russian Revolution is going on, the French are fighting off the Turks too in the Ottoman territories. And so the aftermath of World War One, we have not only the aftermath of World War One, we also then have the Russian Revolution that's going on, and the Russian Civil War that I all talked about, and then the French continually fighting with the Turks in terms of the Ottoman Empire and what to do about it. And we have to really divide up the Ottoman Empire. That was the whole point. How do we go about doing so? Now here we have the extent of the losses of the Ottoman Empire with this map, the Ottoman boundary in 1807 during the course of the 19th century on into the early 20th century in terms of World War One and thereafter. And if you can see what is going on here is this not disintegration but the breaking up of the empire, and then oh gosh, I keep going back and forth. I'm looking at my slides. I know you can't see me looking at my slides, but I want to get them down and I can't. And what results is the formation of Turkey. In the breakup of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, we have then the breakup of the empire into various regions. And then we'll see shortly spheres of influence. And that's going to be an important term, spheres of influence. We see it here. We'll see it then also in the aftermath of World War II. And it becomes a very problematic concept, the spheres of influence. So we have then the formation of Turkey, and then we have there, you can see Palestine, Syria, and what's called the Transjordan. We have Arabia, Iran. Iran was simply Persia. I'll be talking about Iran in a minute. And then Egypt and Cyrenaica. So we have all these different territories in Macedonia, Albania, Bosnia. So we have these development of the Balkans. Here we go and Eastern Europe, and with Serbia and Austria and Hungary right there. And we have this whole breakup of what had been the Ottoman Empire breaks up, and we have then Greece and Macedonia, and then the Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Serbia and Moldavia and Wallachia and Hungary, and this all right there as independent states that formed out of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, and then also the creation of Turkey thereafter, and then we have then Iraq and Lebanon and Syria and Palestine. Now, it had to be more than just that, the partitioning of the Ottoman Empire, which is established in the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920. And doing that officially, and this is part two of the League of Nations, which we talked about as part of the aftermath of World War I, the establishment of the League of Nations. Because this, keep in mind, World War I was simply known as the Great War, and it was seen as the war to end all wars, and we have to make sure that this never happens again. And Woodrow Wilson, with his 14 points, the concept of the self-determination of nations begins at this time. and arguing against this imperialistic, Western imperialistic, colonial, nationalistic um, furtherance of trying to divide up the globe. Begins the process of what's called decolonization. It doesn't complete it by any means, as we'll see shortly. But it was the solution. The idea was we have to begin to get over and step back from this imperialism, which had led to World War I in the context of nationalism. So what did they do? They established mandates between the French and the British over the region we refer to as the Middle East, which had been the Ottoman Empire. Under the French mandate, they were to be in control of, and this is the sphere of influence concept too in terms of mandates, they were to be the governing overseers of Lebanon, Damascus, Aleppo, Al-Wait, which were independent entities and peoples, which had not exist. They're coming from local territories that then take the name of a larger region. And today we don't talk about Aleppo or Al-Wait. We do. Damascus is a city. Lebanon is a country. But what happened with Damascus, Aleppo, and Al-Wait, and there's a couple of others, they joined together. The French said, okay, well, in 1922, we're just going to join them all together to form the Syrian Federation of Syria. Now, Syria, as I said before, was the name of the region that the Romans gave Palestine, Syria, after the Bar Kokhba revolt. So the term Syrian was there, but you see in the French mandate, it only becomes a federation consisting of Damascus, Aleppo, and Al-Wait. And they then recognized, too, Lebanon as an independent state, but still under the mandate. So from this 1, 2, 3, 4, they created four regions, states. They created two: the Syrian and the Lebanon. Syria finally gained its independence in 1930. So that's the French mandate. Then we have the British mandate. And in the British mandate, again, talking about the regions, we have the Transjordan, Palestine, and Iraq that the British were to oversee. Now, if you look at this following map, here's the League of Nations mandates in 1920. You have Syria under French, you have Iraq and Transjordan, Palestine under the British, and you have Damascus, and you have Lebanon. That was what was going on. And so we divide up the territory. And doing so, too, then led to the creation of other new, quote-unquote, states or political entities. Iraq is established in 1921 as an independent state. Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is founded and established in 1932. And Iran's a problem because Iran was simply the Persian Empire. Persia had been there forever. Now, keep in mind, Iraq and Iran, that's Mesopotamia. That's the origins of civilization itself. That weren't referred to as Iran and Iraq early on. Iran was Persia. But there's Iran, the term Iran has ancient origins too, so it kind of went back and forth. But in 1935, Iran said, we want to be called Iran here and now. Because why? Persia was always seen in relationship to Alexander and to the West. So we are almost going to like insulate and use a term or name that is more indigenous, more Arabic. And that is Iran. And so it is clear that in 1935, Iran. Jordan is, I didn't put Jordan up here, I should have, because Transjordan is referring to the region. Jordan becomes a nation or a state, no, I shouldn't say nation, a state at the same time. Now, we have up here too the Middle East in 1930, because this kind of settles down these mandated. And here we have 1930 map with Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Sudan. We have the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia there. It's not quite yet a kingdom. We have Yemen, Aden, Oman, Qatar, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria. And there is then Palestine and Lebanon, and with the city of Jerusalem there. And that's the situation in 1930 in terms of the map. Still under French dominance, or British dominance. And you see some there, the Italian dominance in Libya and Spanish dominance up there over in the north and south of Morocco. But in terms of the actual Middle East that we're looking at, we have French and English, the yellow and the red. Or are we British? The yellow is independent. Sorry. So that's not, we have Turkey independent, Iran independent, Saudi Arabia becomes independent, Egypt is independent, but then we have the British mandates of Sudan, Iraq in the red, French mandates in the green. And that is the tension that's going on. So we have Britain and France essentially looking over the territory, having recognized the independence of some of these new countries, including Turkey, which is what was left of the Ottoman Empire that had governed all of it. Um, and we have then the issue of what to do with the Jews, because there is no Jewish state, there is no Palestinian state, but there is the region of Palestine ruled over by the British and the Mandate, just as it had been in Roman times. What is a political entity and what isn't? Now, I have up here nationalism and the rise of Zionism, because the problem with the mandates is there's no place for the Jews. They live in the region, but there's no place for them. So what do? This gets back to the whole realization of, and stepping back a little bit, the rise of nationalism in the 19th century. And there began to be calls for a Jewish nationalism that became termed Zionism. So we have Zionism equals Jewish nationalism, which is simply saying we need a state, we need a homeland to be called our home, where we won't be subject to persecution, pogroms, everything else. And anti-Semitism goes a long way back, all the way to the Christian writings in the New Testament and thereafter, and we have all kinds of the problems and go through the history of anti-Semitism there. But they don't have an independent country. They have no place to kind of join together. The Jews are in diaspora, as it's called. They're spread out. A lot of Jews it ended up being in Russia, because when they are kind of kicked out of the Byzantine Empire, or the Roman Empire after the Bar Kokhba revolt, they go to Russia, which then was kind of under the sphere of the Byzantine Empire until, into the Byzantine Empire in 1453. So there's a lot of Jews in Russia and in Eastern Europe. But in the 19th century, there is rise of pogroms against the Jews in Eastern Europe and Russia. Now, pogrom simply means rounding up Jews and killing them. The first time happened in 1095, 96, as the Crusaders are on their way to march to the Holy Land to fight off the infidel, the Turk, who had taken Jerusalem and was threatening Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire. And on the way, they said, why are we going all the way out there to fight the infidel? We should, we have the problems here with the Jews at home. So the first pogroms in Europe happened by the Crusaders on their way to the Holy Land. And there was kind of waves, ups and downs in terms of the Middle Ages and anti-Semitism and pogroms against the Jews, all the way through early modern Europe as well. But in the 19th century, that really increases. And why? Because of the rise of nationalism. All of a sudden, there's this sense in the Eastern European states and in Russia of we are a people. We are a people with a geographical territory, and these Jews are not part of us. We need to get rid of the Jews till we can be who we are as a people. I don't care if they've been living here for centuries, they don't belong here. So again, associating a nationalist idealism with a given political territory and an identity that was not based on the inhabitants of the region, but let's say the dominant or predominant majority of inhabitants of the regions without some kind of ethnic, cultural, linguistic unity. And the Jews did not have that linguistic unity, cultural unity, even though culturally they did. I mean, Russian Jews were Russian. Eastern European Jews were Eastern European. German Jews were German. But they weren't seen that way because they weren't Christian. Because at this time, in these territories still, it's either in Russia and Eastern European it's Orthodox, the Orthodox Greek tradition in Russia, and also in their influence in Eastern Europe. In Western Europe or Central and Western Europe, it is then still Christianity, whether it's Catholic or Protestant. And the Jewish religion was different from both. And then we have Islam from outside, and the Jews aren't quite Islamic because Islam is still sort of our threat we're seeing. But what do we do with it? We can allow Islam to be there in Saudi Arabia and in Iraq and Iran, and fine if we're under the mandates, if they want to practice Islam, that's fine. And this is before the mandates. This is, the Ottoman Empire we know is the Turk in the 19th century and on to the later 19th century. So it's the Turk is the Ottoman Empire, and it's problematic. I already talked about that in terms of the wars to weaken the Ottoman Empire. And so the idea was to first by these good Christian, British, and French, Protestant, Catholic leaders and political leaders, the Britons said, okay, in response to this renewed increase of pogroms in Eastern Europe and Russia, we really need to do something to protect the Jews. And they established a British consulate in Jerusalem in 1838. It's the first diplomatic institution in the region to serve as a focal point for, let's say, the Jewish problem, as a means of coordinating Jews in the diaspora in light of the increasing threat of pogroms in Eastern Europe and Russia. But it's not simply limited to Eastern Europe and Russia, as we'll see shortly. And then in 1841 to 1842, we have letters sent by British officials and politicians to the consulate in Jerusalem calling for the establishment of a Jewish state. Keep in mind, this is before the mandates and all this. Still, we have the Ottoman Empire very much alive and kicking there. So we need to have an independent Jewish state because we can't just allow the Jews to be subsumed under the Ottoman rule because Ottomans are Muslim, they're not Jewish. We need to somehow have an independent Jewish state. In 1870, the British establishment for Jewish agricultural settlements in Palestine as a territorial region. What that means is that under the kind of the oversight of the consulate, they said, okay, we will overlook the establishment of Jewish communities, agricultural communities, in the region or territory of Palestine, which is then where Jerusalem is, of course. That's 1870. This becomes the beginnings of the kibbutz, or the kibbutzim, the agricultural settlements, to a way of bringing in Jews to say, here is a safe place for you. Because you are threatened. As Christians, we're going to protect you. There's, Christian relationship between Christian and Jews have been so tense for so long and so almost contradictory because there's a lot, and had been going all the way back of anti-Semitism. I already mentioned the pogroms. First pogroms were committed by the Crusaders. But there was also a sense of we are responsible to protect the Jews because the Jews are God's chosen people, but so are we. Christians are the new chosen people of God. And the Jews will finally come around. The 10 lost tribes, i.e., the kingdom of Israel, will join back and be found with the kingdom of Judah, and they will all become Christian, and that will end the world because it will all be Christian, and it'll be also wonderful. So we have this sense of Christian protectionism of Jews, responsibility for Jews, because they have no one else to take care of them. The Turks aren't going to take care of them. I mean, Turkish government allowed them to live within the Ottoman Empire and supported them. So they were basically theoretically equal with Muslims, but not really. They had Christians in the same boat. They're not really equal, but kind of seen as that way. And so there's this bizarre relationship of the Christian West, so to speak, of what to do with the Jews. And this attempt of saying, okay, especially in light of the pogroms in terms of nationalism, and Russia and Eastern Europe, saying we have to kind of purify our nation. British and French are saying, no, well, we're going to protect you because that's part of our identity, is protecting, as Christian identity, is protecting the Jews. Now we can say, well, why, if Russians were Orthodox, why didn't they? It's an issue of then nationalism and, let's say, religious Christian ideology being subsumed as part of nationalism rather than the guiding principle for it. I mean, that gets into theological issues. And also there's political issues because Russia and the Russian Empire at the time is still seen as a threat to British and French and German interests, not so much because German was more light. And so if they can do anything that will counter Russian influence, that will be good too. So by supporting the Jews, they're also countering Russia, who's trying to get rid of them and killing them and so. So that is kind of a very complex situation. And in 1881 to 1882, then there are increased massive pogroms in Russia. So what do we do? How do we deal with all of this? And shortly thereafter is what's called the Dreyfus Affair, and this is with France. As I said, the tensions between Christians and Jews had always been difficult, and the Dreyfus Affair brought that out to the fore and made it extremely public and international. Alfred Dreyfus was a French citizen. He was from the area of the Alsace-Lorraine, that region between France and Germany that had been fought over ever since the Treaty of Verdun in 843. He rose up within the French military, seen as very successful, very well educated. During the Franco-Prussian War, when Alsace-Lorraine was divided, the people living there were given the choice: do you want to follow France or do you want to follow Germany? And he said, no, France is my country. So it got to be tension. And he became suspect. There were anti-Semitic feelings very strong in France, even though France was supporting them, the Jews as such. And they seized upon the rise of Alfred Dreyfus as a way of getting rid of him, of getting rid of Jewish influence. And to make a long story short, there's a great little book on it. There's a lot been written about it. Dreyfus was set up. There were forgeries, made letters and evidence forged that indicated that he had been passing state secrets to the Germans. Which again, France, Germany was right there, and Germany is more closely allied with, Russia and Austria-Hungary. And what do we do about this? Because Germany's a threat, especially after the unification of Germany in 1870. And the whole Franco-Prussian War, the problems and the establishment of the Second German Reich. Again, nationalism, which the French had been, very well developed nationalism in France. So there's all these tensions. And Dreyfus was charged with treason. He protested his innocence, but he was accused of treason and imprisoned. It was only years later that it came out that this was all a setup and a forgery. But the shock of that, the shock that this decorated general and military leader, who was a loyal Frenchman, was set up for treason because he was Jewish, brought out a whole recognition of the problems of anti-Semitism in France and Central Europe, and on we go. And in 1896, as the Dreyfus Affair was making its headway, Theodor Herzl calls for a Jewish state. Kind of the first time that we see this after the letters, the Britain consulate letters calling for a Jewish state. Calls for a Jewish state in 1896. And in 1897, under Herzl's leadership, the first Zionist Congress was called, or of the World Zionist Organization. So there was an international organization created to call for Jewish nationalism, the creation of a Jewish state to protect the Jews, to give the Jews a place to live and call their own and govern themselves. In some ways, so the Europeans don't have to anymore. In face of all these pogroms and expulsions and all the problems involved in this new nationalistic, imperialistic world, pogroms continued. And in 1905, the Russian pogroms, the response to the more Russian pogroms was the support of founding new of these agricultural settlements in the region of Palestine and established Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv, which translates as the Old New Land, was the title of a book by Herzl, but it's establishing a city for Jews. Now, it was Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is still under um, Islamic control, Arab control. So all of a sudden, Tel Aviv was established as a new city for Jews, and in there we have the founding of Hebrew schools and the cultivation of all these new settlements coming in to teach children, to teach them in Hebrew, and to emphasize the importance of Hebrew, to preserve the language, including the establishment of the Jewish University in 1918. Now, we have World War I and all that was going on within World War I. No Jewish state. The Ottoman Empire still is in control. In 1917, as the war is still going on, even though it's beginning to be clear that the West might win, but still not. They're still dealing with the Jewish question. And the British Parliament issues the Balfour Declaration in 1917, because that's all part of World War I, what to do, especially if the Ottoman Empire is going to be broken up. What do we do with the Jews? And the Balfour Declaration calls for a Jewish homeland. It does not say Jewish state, but it says it calls for a Jewish homeland in the region of Palestine, as well as recognizing the rights of the Arab inhabitants in the region of Palestine. So we see here, Palestine is not a state. It's a region in which there were Jews living and Muslim Arabs living. And the Balfour Declaration says, you know what? We need to recognize the right not only of the Arab inhabitants within still at this point the Ottoman Empire, but then also the Jews who are living in the region of Palestine. Now, we have up there then the British Mandate after World War I. We have the British Mandate. Now, the Arabs did not accept the Balfour Declaration. The Arabs didn't really accept the British Mandate either. Remember, I talked about the mandates. The mandates of 1920, region of Palestine under British rule, because the mandate we already talked about was following the Balfour Declaration, which again I already said the Arabs did not accept, and they rejected it. And that led eventually to the Arab revolt in Palestine, 1936 to 1939, saying, no, we're not going to accept this. This is our territory. This is our land. Now, keep in mind, there had never been a Palestinian state. It was a geographical territory and region ruled by various political entities. There was never a political entity of Palestine. It was until we get to the region controlled by the Britons and the Mandate after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. It's a region. Even the Balfour Declaration recognizes it as a region in which we find that Arabs, which will recognize their rights, and the increasing and growing population of the Jews, because more Jews are moving to the region. More Jews are moving to Palestine. And that was part of the problem that led to the Arab Revolt, which then led to what's called the British White Paper of 1939. And that is one of the assignments, your reading assignment text for this week is the British White Paper of 1939. And here it was an attempt to say, okay, after the Arab Revolt, here is our plan for dealing with the situation. We can make Palestine an independent nation with a national homeland for the Jews. So we'll have an independent Palestine in which there'll be a recognized national homeland for the Jews, without really detailing precisely what that would consist of. And you can read how all the articles of that British white paper that was to serve as the basis for solving the problem of the Middle East in terms of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. And at this time, too, by this time, oil becomes increasingly important. Now, there's a quote I know I've seen. I didn't include it on the slide because I couldn't find it again. But it's kind of in the aftermath of World War One and breaking up the Ottoman Empire, and let's say the arguments and struggles for who gets control of what. And I believe it was the British, one of the British officials involved in the negotiations said, you know what, this Middle East, it's the biggest prize in history because of the oil. Do we really even want to let them be independent? Shouldn't we, if we can control it, we can reap the benefits? Because oil is important. Now, oil has been around, but it's really the early 20th century when oil is discovered in the Middle Eastern countries and territories, which led to, as we know, increased super wealth. Because by this time, the importance of gasoline, of oil, to fuel war, to fuel automobiles increasingly being used, to fuel airplanes that were just beginning to be used, it was essential. So if we can somehow deal with the Middle East problem, we have to do so in a way that we still can somehow gain enough control or access to the oil that's there because we need it for our national security. Why do you think the United States is on such good terms with the Saudis? Talking about hypocrisy. But the Saudis are fine. So, they can kill Khashoggi, and we kind of turn the other way. It's an issue of power, influence, and authority. If we can gain access diplomatically to the wealth of the oil or the need for the oil, yeah, we'll let them reap benefits too. That's better than doing so militarily, or we'll do it militarily. It's a problem. And the wealth involved from oil in the Middle East became huge, which leads to all kinds of conflicts within the region itself. Meanwhile, the British are trying to settle the problem, at least of Palestine, with their white paper, and the Arabs reject it. The Arabs reject it, say, no, we're not going to accept an independent Palestine in which there is a Jewish national homeland. No go. So the British white paper was not really a two-state solution. I have up there the two-state solution. It was not really a two-state solution, but it was working in that direction of saying, look, what we need, basically something. What do we do with the region of Palestine? How can we manage this? Can we create new countries, as we already did with Syria and Jordan, and, Lebanon, and all the others, with the breakup of the Ottoman Empire? Why can't we just create two states? They were touchy there. They hadn't really quite got there yet. Because on the one hand, Jews and Arabs are all the same. They're all Semitic tribal peoples. Ethnically, culturally, they're different. Religiously, obviously, they're different. That was the situation in 1939. Still remained. Now, if the Arabs had said, great, that will work, history would have been radically different. But they didn't. Why? Because, for all the political reasons involved, according to the Quran, the region of Palestine was their holy land, the promised land that God had promised the descendants of Ishmael. We can't renege on a divine decree and promise that is in our Quran. This is our land by divine right. And the Jews are saying, it's our land. This is our promised land. shouldn't we respect differing religions? Yeah, but not in our territory. That's the problem. 1939. And then the Holocaust, because that also affected and changed the dynamic from let's try to come up with a solution to this is the way it's going to be. We'll see that, though, after we talk about World War II, or what would become known as World War II. But this whole entire history of the Middle East, going all the way back, is central for understanding what happens after World War II, as well as what happens in World War II, and what happens and is happening still today in the region with the conflicts. There we go. That's what I have for today. Next week, we'll start with the lead up to what has become known as World War II, and then World War II, we'll go from there. We're getting closer and closer and closer all the time. Thank you for your patience. If you have any questions, please just ask, and I'll see you again shortly. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.